Now I'd like to turn it over to Katherine, who is going to talk to us about African American women's relationship with money and saving.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to be able to just hear perspectives from people doing similar work. And I'd really like to piggyback on what you were saying about African Americans and debt, because that really is my primary focus. What inspired my work on looking at asset accumulation among African Americans, in particular the more top-earning African Americans, was my work with women of color in corporate management. I was just very very struck by, in doing focus groups and doing in-depth interviews among women who were very successful at, say, very senior positions in their organizations and who had high status based on wages. If you dug down a little bit deeper into the context of their lives, you could see that for many, they were literally just one paycheck away from being in real trouble financially. And further, in looking at the broader context of their lives, I did some research, some secondary research on asset gaps and also on intergenerational economic mobility. You know, you're talking about the importance of what children see and how that really impacts their own behavior. And I was very struck by a statistic. I found that if you look at top-earning African Americans versus top-earning white Americans, and you look at the income status of their children, you'll see that African Americans are about 3 times as likely to have their children end up in the bottom 10% of the income distribution versus top-earning white Americans. It's very striking. It really seems that membership in the black middle class, the black upper middle class, is almost like a revolving door, where the gains of one generation made such an effort to accumulate that they don't necessarily get a chance to pass that status down to their children. And if you actually, we can go to the next slide, which is the wealth gap. Just to give you some rather startling statistics on the wealth gap. I guess first I should just define the difference between income and assets. I know that it's been touched on in terms of the importance of savings. In my work with corporate management, we often talk about the wage gap, as in, it's really terrible that, say, women of color only earn 50-some cents for every dollar, say, that white men earn. But actually, if you dig down, what's more important to financial stability and more important to quality of life is assets. I mean, income is what you earn, what comes into you on a regular basis, and that pays for day-to-day living expenses. But assets, your nest egg, your savings and investments, is very, very important for maintaining status for the next generation. Obviously, assets pay for retirement, pays for big ticket items like college, and for startup for businesses, and for gifts that really help adult children get started in their lives. I mean, typically, it's much more common in this country for white Americans to be able to afford to give their adult children the down payment for their house. It's much, much less likely that that happens for African Americans. And historically, how we got to this major wealth gap that you see, where the median wealth is only about, literally, African Americans have a dime in wealth for white's dollar, is that there's been an historic disaccumulation of assets in the African American community. So if you go back to, going back to slavery, obviously, African Americans started with nothing. And then later in the next century, there was still Jim Crow that took away opportunities to build assets, that took away, for example, land ownership opportunities. And going farther, say, into the middle of the last century, there was a huge social welfare effort to really raise the working class to the middle class. That was the GI Bill. But in the 40s, white Americans had much, much more access to that program than African Americans. So they didn't get the boost in terms of asset building, home ownership that whites did. And that sort of disaccumulation of assets has really kept up over time. And it's really been reinforced by what still exists in terms of discrimination in the job market. In spite of what I was saying about assets being more important than income, income is still a means to build assets. And we see from research that others have done that typically it takes longer within a corporate environment for African Americans to get promoted. David Thomas at Harvard has done some key work in this area, saying that typically, and I've seen it also in my work from Catalyst, that typically a message that African Americans get in their corporate careers is you need one more experience before we can promote you. You need to prove yourself. If you take a lateral move, you may get higher skills, but it won't necessarily be what's necessary to get you to that next level. And it's particularly striking and particularly bad for women of color because essentially we're at a double remove from people in power in terms of not getting the networking access, not getting the mentorship from white males who typically do just hold the reins of power. And then we really can't ignore just what's happened recently, especially with predatory lending and the housing market with African Americans. I think one thing that people may not realize is that African Americans start really at a disadvantage in housing because typically housing in predominantly black neighborhoods, the accumulation of value is much less. In fact, sometimes over time, housing prices, housing values actually decline in African American neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods. And what we do know from other research about investing habits is that African Americans don't invest as much in the stock market as we should, don't take those higher risk investments that have a higher return. And if you look at where most African American assets are, they are in the home. And here we have homes that are depreciating over time versus building up in their value. And even more depressing news, sorry to sort of be the downer versus your presentation, but we have predatory lending that has disproportionately affected even upper income African Americans. You may have read reports that there were, say, middle class African Americans with fairly stable financial situations who were really entitled to better loans, and yet they didn't get them. They were still the victims of predatory lending. So all that is really, the predatory lending, which is leading to losses of houses, which again are the main source of assets. Predatory lending accompanied by the high unemployment in this last recession is leading to just a massive disaccumulation of assets, and it's making it much harder for African Americans to really have a firm status and that they'll be able to pass on to children. I also just want to point out the very startling statistic about, the prior slide, about if you look at single black women in the prime of their working years versus white women, the assets are just strikingly much worse. Literally, an average is $5 versus $42,000 for white women. And actually, again, just talking about the double whammy of being both a minority and female, the average assets for men of color is about $11,000. So single women of color are really at quite a disadvantage when it comes to assets. Then in terms of just what's in the next line on protecting assets, one thing I'm trying to do in the work I'm doing is not just looking at giving financial advice. I mean, there's a lot of really great financial advice out there. Obviously, plan for retirement, invest wisely, avoid credit card debt. But in the more psychologically and sociologically based work that I've done, I see that there are barriers that really keep African Americans, especially African American women, from taking full advantage of this really great advice. And I'll talk a little bit about what I call the psychological black tax, but because my work is really grounded in what happens with careers, I wanted to start a little bit with looking at the dynamics of careers and how African Americans, and especially African American women, can really hopefully gain in assets by being a little bit more savvy in career planning. My first bullet is about having a realistic view of careers, and going back to David Thomas's work, just knowing that it may simply take longer to get to a higher position versus white peers. So, you know, when you look at having to take a lateral move, just really think about whether, you know, is this going to get me to where I need to go? Should I take a lateral move, or should I, you know, and my research has shown this and others as well, should I move out to move up? You know, should I, even in this really tricky economic time, think aggressively about changing a company, changing a firm, so that I can get a boost in income and therefore simply have a better chance of contributing to an asset base. Another thing that I'm seeing is, over time, I would say in the 14 plus years that I've been doing research on women of color in corporate management, that bias is becoming both more subtle and more covert. So it's harder to call out. But realistically, African Americans, particularly African American women, really need to have an exit strategy in mind. I mean, at this point in our country, African Americans, and again, especially African American women, being at a double remove from, you know, the people who are most predominant in upper hierarchies right then, we're really still outside the circles of protection and power. You know, when it comes to laying off people within corporations and firms, African Americans are looking up and finding out that they may be getting dismissed for what seem to be almost arbitrary reasons. I mean, there's still discrimination in the job market. It may be couched as, you know, you didn't do X, Y, or Z, and yet when you compare the rates of who's leaving corporations and firms, you'll see that African Americans are being disproportionately affected. One thing, too, that's important is having a supplemental income stream. I know some people call it having a side hustle, which is just very, very savvy in these times, to not be so dependent on just one source of income, but to, for example, to invest in real estate and have an income stream from, say, rental properties, to invest in looking at entrepreneurship, in having a job that is really of one's own making and that one can be independent from a larger corporate structure. I'm also thinking in terms of just the pressure points that come with what I've called it in my other work hyper visibility, where African American women in senior positions are, you know, one of very, very few. And there's this real pressure that comes from knowing that you're just totally under scrutiny at so many points within your working career. And I'm doing some work now in looking at how women of color cope with navigating organizational environments versus how white women cope. And I'm seeing this huge difference in themes where the white women may talk about, oh yes, you know, I really need to network more and I need to find a powerful mentor, and you know, I'm going to join the women's network and really ensure myself, you know, some better exposure. But from particularly African American women, I'm finding a theme of guardedness where, you know, I really have to keep to myself any mistakes that I feel I might make or any kind of developmental needs I have. I don't want them to know that I'm not perfect in doing whatever I'm doing. And one quote that really struck me was, sort of the guiding principle of one of the women that we interviewed was, never let them see you sweat. And I simply have not seen any sentiment like that expressed in the white women's focus groups and qualitative that I'm reviewing right now. So, you know, given the intense level of pressure, the guardedness to never let them see you sweat, there's an escape valve that's needed. I mean, emotionally, you really need to pamper yourself in some way. And in other work I've done where I've looked at top earning African Americans and have more specifically asked them about their spending habits and about the sort of emotional triggers for spending, you know, when you're feeling under so much pressure at work, you may end up overspending as a way to pamper yourself. Another kind of thing related to hypervisibility is that in terms of self-presentation, you may feel that you simply have to spend more on yourself to look acceptable within a majority environment. So, you know, there's a lot of blogs about being frugal and, you know, really cutting down and, you know, why go to a hairdresser? You really don't need to. But if you talk to African American women, I mean, it's very, very hard for us to feel that we're looking presentable without getting some kind of professional help with hair, just the way the conservatism around appearance works. And in one of my focus groups, I heard a very interesting comment from a young woman who was saying, that she simply had a different body type from many of her white colleagues. And she said, you know, maybe they can buy off-the-rack suits and look okay within a corporate environment. But as she was saying, you know, I just have a differently shaped body. You know, I just have this full figure. And I need to buy something that's more expensive so that I can look presentable within my environment. And so it's those little, the hypervisibility that's kind of forcing African American women to spend more than ideally they should. And I want to go on just to a larger issue. It's the next slide, coping with the psychological black tax. What I'm saying about what happens in the workplace really just brings up the broader issue of just the strain of living in a racist society. It's the extra effort that blacks have to go to in terms of even coping with, I guess you can call them micro inequities, but they're also really macro inequities. When you think about the strain of being pulled over by the police for no reason, which happens more actually with African American men, or being treated with a lack of respect in so many different kinds of venues within the society, you know, being followed by shopkeepers, being discounted, having one's opinions discounted in other venues. Overspending is really a way to comfort oneself, and it's one type of self-medication that really has to be addressed. I think, you know, in terms of having African Americans save wisely, spend wisely, etc., we can't really ignore the stresses and the strains that are at the basis of many people just not being able to follow that sage financial advice. We need to really address some of these underlying problems. And the next slide. One thing that we probably don't have a lot of time to go into today, there's a whole other aspect of my work that extends beyond having or helping African Americans build their own assets, and it's really about preparing their children for the future so that they could really be in place to build their own wealth and guard their own wealth. And right now I'm developing workshops on basically helping parents help children be able to successfully navigate racist environments. Because, I mean, clearly, ideally, we would like structural discrimination to disappear overnight. And I certainly support organizations that are pushing to do this, but in my focus groups and interviews, I'm getting the feedback, you know, we need to do something now. You know, what can we do now? How can we be more comfortable talking about our children with some of these sensitive issues? One thing I found was that, you know, I was saying before that the major source of assets for African Americans is the home, and in predominantly African American neighborhoods, the housing values depreciate. There's an interesting kind of flip side to that, which is there certainly is a segment of African Americans who live in predominantly white neighborhoods, and their housing values are going to be pretty good, they're going to appreciate, and yet, when I looked at this segment within my focus groups, I was seeing that the parents of children in these neighborhoods had a really difficult time talking frankly about racism. I mean, they were in predominantly white schools. Within the educational system, at least among the people I talked with, there seemed to be less discrimination, and their children basically were unprepared for the realities of what they would find in the workplace and in environments outside of their schools. And it's interesting that, you know, these parents were working so hard to, again, build their assets, pass their assets on to their children, and yet they had a lot of discomfort in just talking frankly about, you know, how you can navigate these environments and how you can keep these negative environments from disrupting your own efforts to build wealth. So I'll stop there for now, and if there are any questions later, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.